What do you say, y'all? Can you believe it's week 11 already? Time seems to be flying. Let's get into it. How's everything going? Hope your week is going well. I'm actually doing okay with the grading. All the quizzes are graded. I think I'm caught up except for the interview paper, which I'm starting today, and I'll be able to plow through slowly. So I thank you again for your patience on that. But again, we should have all the grades posted except for those. In terms of other stuff, I had said, hey, yeah, get me your church visitation locations by Friday, and then saw that I forgot to post a place for you to put them. So went ahead and did that and backed up the date a week. So if you already know what you want, awesome. Go ahead and put them in. If you already know what you're doing, get that done so I can give you feedback and say, yes, move forward, or have you considered this? Otherwise, you have until March 30th now to do it. And that gives you a lot of time because the paper itself is due April 27th. So you have a fair amount of time to do it, but it's just basically me being dumb and going, oh yeah, didn't give you a place to submit it, so let me give you more time as a result. That's the reason for the change. So the syllabus says March 23rd, but if you look at the assignment itself, it actually says March 30th, and that is correct. That's the one that actually is right. That's the only bit of housekeeping I have. Everything else okay? So far, so good. As always, I'll get to your questions and emails and messages as quickly as I can. Do not hesitate to reach out. Also, if you need something beyond email, Skype, FaceTime, they're all available. Don't hesitate. Say, can we set something up? And I will be more than happy to do that with you and be as much help as I can because that's why I'm here. So anyway, we did our church history block in 2 weeks. We covered a lot of the different periods that exist, the biblical period, obviously, but also the patristic period, the church fathers, which culminates with Augustine, who's kind of the greatest church father, also a bridge into the medieval period. We talked about scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas. We talked about how the medieval period was a period in which the Catholic Church gained an enormous amount of power, so much so that it became a bit problematic, and you have the Reformation where Martin Luther and others challenged that power. You see the split into denominations, Catholics and Protestants, Anabaptists, and then even within Protestantism, the Lutheran, Calvinists, you start to get the labels, the different groups. And they will obviously proliferate rapidly to the point now where today where we have thousands and thousands of denominations. But you have the great splitting, well, not even splitting, the great, I don't know, the image in my head is gone. It was going to be something really profound too. But you get the idea. It's starting to split. And we just barely scraped into the modern period, not much. We're going to talk about elements of the modern period as we move forward. We're going to talk about the civil rights movement, which is a major development in Christianity in the 20th century, at least in America. We're going to talk about other things as well. But that was a pretty hefty 2 weeks. I think last time we talked for about an hour, which I don't want to do today. But moving, just to give you kind of setting up where we're headed, as these periods move, especially as we move into the Reformation/Renaissance period, the world begins to shrink. There is more contact between denominations and between religions, just as there is also more contact for different nations and people groups. People are starting to interact with each other now. You can't assume that everyone is going to be exactly like you, because even if they're culturally like you, or coming from the same region, they might have different religious tendencies. They might be a Protestant, or you might be a Catholic, or that other person might be an Anabaptist. Or you might share, or you might even be completely different to the point of, oh wow, this person has come from the East and they're Islam, and what is that? How does that work? How does that brush up against my Catholicism? You get more contact starting to happen between denominations, between religions. And what happens when they come into contact? Well, sometimes learning. Aquinas is one. Aquinas scholars have looked into his work and have seen the influence of being pushed by Jewish scholars, for instance, by Islamic scholars. He is one where Aquinas scholars looked at him and said he is one who is responding to different cultures bumping up against his doorstep, even though it's a really subtle way, it's not obvious. You don't think of the medieval period as multicultural. But Aquinas was starting to do that, and it would only continue as time moves forward. So sometimes it's great. Sometimes you see in the best way where you can be pushed by someone who believes differently from you. You can learn. You can integrate that into your own work. So there's learning and understanding. But more often than that, there's killing and persecution. We talked about it already. Catholics killing Protestants. Catholics killing Anabaptists. Protestants killing Anabaptists as well. Everyone killed Anabaptists. When these differences brush up against each other, a lot of times it ends ugly. It ends badly. It ends with, even if it's not outright murder and persecution, you start to have a little thing called colonialism, which starts to happen, where it's like, it's just kind of overt. This culture is better than this one. This culture is superior to this one. You get a lot of stuff going on. And one of the ways, talking about Christianity, one of the ways in which we have to engage that is talking about missionaries. And one of the reasons I love this next book that we're walking into, Silence, is because it's the story of two Western missionaries, two Portuguese missionaries in Japan. And it allows us a lot of opportunities to talk about this. What happened? Because one of the things from a religious perspective, all religions, but Christianity has a long history of this. When Christians come into contact with non-Christians, there is something called the missionary impulse, which is a part of history. Even to this day, it's still a part of the present day, where the Christian feels compelled to reach out to the non-Christian and say, hey, you need to become Christian. I mean, this is the missionary story. So we're getting into Silence. I'd ask you to read the translator's preface, the prologue, and chapters 1 through 5 this week. We'll do the rest of it next week. You can read Martin Scorsese's foreword if you like. You don't have to. I mean, it's okay. It's like 2 pages. It's short. It's interesting just because it's a master filmmaker who decided to make Silence into a movie, and you get some of his motivation for why he loves this story. But you don't have to read it. But you do have to read the translator's preface because it's really important. Prologue 1 through 5, and then the rest of the novel next week. Silence was written by a man named Shusaku Endo, Japanese Catholic writer, and he is telling the story of. Oh, I forgot what book that is. You know what? I meant to do this with a copy of Silence next to me, so I'm going to run and grab it. I apologize for this. What a brain fart that was. But I will be right back because I want to have the copy of the book next to me. So hold the thought. I'll be right back. How embarrassing. And the phone ringing too. We got everything going on today. Oh, what a mess. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to have it in front of me because there's some stuff I want to read and also just to have it. Anyway, so Endo is a Japanese Catholic. He is writing in the 20th century. This book came out, the original came out in the 70s, I think. But it's a story of 17th century Portuguese missionaries and their struggle in Japan. And for an introduction to Christianity class, it's a novel. It's a historical novel from a Japanese author about Portuguese missionaries. So why are we going? 69 was the original, 1969. So why would we read such a thing? Well, there's lots of reasons, and I've already hinted at some. Silence gives us an opportunity to talk about a lot of interesting things. Number one, it gives us an opportunity to talk about the Jesuits. We talked about them briefly last week when we talked about the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation it's also called, one of the 4 branches of the Reformation. By the way, I'm going to ask you that quite a bit because it's going to show up on the next quiz, I guarantee it. Lutheran, Calvinist, radical and Catholic. But the Jesuits are a fundamental part of the Catholic Reformation because they are one of the things to emerge from the Council of Trent, 1545. They are a group, a religious order, and they are characterized by an almost military zeal and passion and organization. They are basically they from their founding, they are founded by military. They are founded by people with military tendencies, military experience, military history. And it translates into what they're trying to do. But instead of working for an earthly army, they are taking those same tendencies of zeal and drive and passion and organization. And they are conveying them into being an army for God, you might say. The Jesuits go around the world and they represent Christ around the world, and they try to convert people to become Christian and specifically become Catholic and Jesuit. Well, obviously Catholic because this is pre-Reformation, but you have what you have with this is the very first missionary in Japan is a Jesuit, and his name is Francis Xavier. He does this in 1549. This story is going to be about two Jesuit priests, two Portuguese Jesuit priests / missionaries who go to Japan for missionary work, and they are representatives of this group, the Jesuits. But they go do missionary work, and we talked about the missionary impulse already, wanting to convert other people to your religion. The impetus for a lot of missionary impulse, well, there's a lot of places, but the most famous is called the Great Commission. The Great Commission is in the Gospels, Gospel of Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the very end of the age." So there is an international flavor here. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations. What is a disciple? Well, technically the word disciple just means learner, but the connotative meaning is that a follower of Christ, a Christian, someone who's learning about Jesus, who's learning how to be a Christian. And there's also a pretty powerful Trinitarian reference here: Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And Jesus promises his presence in that process. But this missionary impulse. Jesus, the command comes from Jesus himself. Go tell people about me, and more, not just tell them, initiate them into this new way of living, this new religious commitment, where we are followers, Christians are followers of Jesus, and teach them what that means and what that looks like and how that operates. Make them you are learners, you are disciples. Make them fellow learners and disciples. And this is the missionary impulse. And again, from the very, very beginning, from the biblical era all the way to 2018, you see the missionary impulse, where Christians will go find non-Christians and attempt to make them become, or to compel them, persuade them to become Christians. Sometimes, in the course of history, it was compelling, and not in a good way. Forceful conversions upon pain of death or physical harm. The Native Americans come to mind, the Spanish explorers during the time of Columbus, that comes to mind. But most times it's this idea of persuasion, of showing them what this looks like and letting the Spirit of God work in converting them to Christianity. Now, missionaries are a controversial topic, even to this day. Because it's a controversial activity, because implicit in the missionary impulse is, hey, the way you're living right now, that's wrong. And you need to switch over to a way of living that's right, and you need to follow the person who you actually need to be following, and leave the other stuff. Leave if it's Buddha, or if it's any other form of religion or form of non-religion. You need to leave that behind, and you need to become a disciple. It's controversial, but if you think about it, in some ways, the missionary impulse and the actions of missionaries are to be respected in that they are an outworking of a serious, literal take on hell and the problem of separation from God. So in a lot of ways, missionaries are taking their theology seriously. Because Orthodox Christian theology from the beginning of time has said if you are not a Christian, you are separated from God. And if you are separated from God when you die, you are bound for eternal punishment, eternal damnation. Now, the doctrine of hell is also very, very controversial. You spend a lot of time thinking about it when you're reading Dante, so I won't rehash too much of it here. But think about this. The missionary who believes that, that is going to give them the drive and the motivation. There's actually, and not just for, quote unquote missionaries as a professional class. I don't know if some of you have seen, there's a famous YouTube clip of the magician Penn Jillette, magician slash talk show host slash everything that guy's involved with. He is a strident atheist and very forthright atheist. But there's a famous YouTube clip that describes the way that he was basically someone who was acting in the capacity of a missionary, even though they weren't a foreign nation. They were presenting him with the Christian message, and they were saying, you need to become a Christian. And what made this clip so viral, what made it so famous, was Penn going, you know what? If they're serious about what they believe, then they are showing love to me by making that offer. And Christians who believe this, but yet are scared to share their religion and scared to invite others to join it with them, are really doing a disservice to the people they claim to love, because they are not telling them, they're not warning them of the fate that lies in store for them after death if they don't become Christian. So it's a famous clip. It's fascinating to watch his thought process. I would recommend that you go watch it. But this is, a lot of ways, this missionary impulse is that, now honestly, missionaries, obviously, the connotation for missionaries is someone who leaves home, who goes to a foreign nation to do this. But the same impulse is present everywhere, and it can be present with Christians who are acting as, quote unquote missionaries to their atheist neighbors, or it can be, in the case of silence, Portuguese priests who go halfway across the world to go be missionaries in Japan. Same impulse motivates both of those drives. We take this theology seriously, and we recognize that due to this, the outworking of this theology is that someone who does not claim Christ as their Savior, someone who does not claim the label Christian, is in for a great deal of trouble beyond the grave once they die. It is eternal punishment, eternal damnation that awaits. And the missionary doesn't want that to happen. So they go and they mission, and they perform as missionaries. Doesn't make it any less controversial, but I'm hoping to show you where that impulse might come from, why someone might feel compelled, especially in the case of silence, to get on a boat and go to a nation that is openly hostile in the hopes of engaging people for Christ once they're there. Why would a sane person do that? This is the motivation. So it gives us a chance to talk about the Jesuits, gives us a chance to talk about the missionary impulse, gives us a chance to talk about all the stuff that so often accompanies the missionary impulse. Because the thing about it is, theology is never done in a vacuum, and missionary work is never done in a vacuum. There's a lot more going on than just theology here. You have the whole idea of territorial expansion and the connection between missionaries, trade routes, and military power. You have colonialism, which we talked about earlier, and if you haven't come across the idea of colonialism yet, you certainly will in the course of your classes. But basically what it is the idea that the long historical paradigm of Westerners believing they knew what was best for Easterners and attempting to impose their will upon Easterners. So we could talk about, the British rule of India. We could talk about, obviously things like the slave trade. We could talk about the ways in which Westerners lorded over Eastern nations and what that looked like and how that worked and the struggle East versus West. But when a Western missionary would go to the East, and even today you see some of this sometimes in the accounts of missionaries, like missionaries will go to the Middle East or go somewhere else. It is very much the vibe of, we are leaving civilization, we're going to this barbaric backwater wilderness, and we're going to plant the flag for Christ. But oftentimes it ends up not just being Christ they're planting the flag for, they're planting a nationalist flag as well. Missionaries are representing Christ, but they're also representing their nation. They're representing the Western world. And you see this in silence and the thought processes of the characters in silence, where they're going, we cannot lose, quote unquote, lose to these infidels. The honor of the church is at stake here, as is the honor of the West. So it's like, well, of course the church is going to prevail, even though on Japanese soil, it's, they're openly hostile to Christianity, and this is going to be a covert operation. But of course, the gospel will take root, and of course, the Christian church in Japan will develop, and of course, it's going to look a lot like the Christian church in the Western nations where we just came from. And of course, everything's going to work out that way because we're awesome, and we carry the true religion with us, and we know what is better for them than they do. And the missionaries in silence openly worry that if we're not allowed to get in there and represent Christianity, that the faith is not going to survive. Basically, they give no credit to the indigenous believers who are already located there. And again, this is a comment in silence is interesting because it tells a story, but this is certainly not limited to silence. A very similar situation played out in places like China, where you had, when China said all the Western missionaries need to get out, there was real hand-wringing about the fate of the church in China. But when the doors were finally open once again, you had something called the Chinese house church movement, in which indigenous leaders spread the gospel and continued the Christian religion's growth. And come to find out, there were a lot of Christians in China by the time the doors were opened. It didn't happen the way the Westerners envisioned, but it didn't mean it didn't happen. So this perspective tends to discount the ability of indigenous believers to be the church leaders and assume that the implanted Westerners need to be the church leaders. That's certainly the vibe in silence, at least for the first half that we're reading this week. So anyway, there's a lot of other stuff going on. There's the colonialist impulse from the West. There's a response from the quote-unquote East, in this case, Japan. Japan acts very cruelly towards missionaries and Christians, but it's not just for spite. They are reacting to the fact that missionaries represent more than just themselves and their religion. They represent their nation and the entire Western world as well. Incoming missionaries could absolutely be a threat to the power of indigenous rulers. If you stir up the society, if you stir up the religious commitments, then you stir up the society, you have other elements going on, and all of a sudden this group that was being led by this leader is a lot less stable. So, of course, the Japanese leaders are going to respond with suspicion. They're going to look at missionaries as potentially paving the way for military conquest. If we can get in and implant the Western religion, maybe it's going to make it easier when we go in and decide in a military fashion to implant Western leadership. All of these were plausible, and all these are thoughts that the Eastern leaders were having. Like, this is something that, if we let a toe in the door with these missionaries, it's going to open the floodgates, and we're going to get a whole bunch of people we don't want. And we're going to get religious conflict. The Japanese were aware of religious conflict in Europe. In this case, as the translator's preface points out, the Dutch versus the Portuguese. A religious fight, and all the other religious fights that were starting to happen and starting to break out. They weren't in the dark about this. And they said, we don't want this. We don't want a replay of Reformation chaos when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other and all of them were killing the Anabaptists. We don't want that here. We're going to keep that out. And then you had something referenced in the translator's preface called the Shimabara Rebellion. It happens in 1632. Seems to confirm the worst fears of the Japanese leadership, because in the Shimabara Rebellion, those who primarily rebelled were Christians. So you have they have this quote unquote Western religion. We'll talk more about that in a second. And they are trying to pave the way for not just Western religion to take over, but also Western politics, Western leadership, Western everything else. And the Japanese leaders respond to that about how you think they would. Not well. So anyway, you have the Western world which sends these missionaries. You have the quote-unquote Eastern world where these missionaries want to go, the indigenous Christians, the ones that are already there, are caught in the middle. In this case, the Japanese Christians are caught in the middle. They're caught in the middle in a very real way over the course of the novel, but even the writer himself, even Endo himself, feels himself caught in the middle, feels like there's a clash going on in the heart of himself, because on the one hand, he is Japanese. This is his ethnic identity, is who he is. But on the other hand, he's Catholic, the quote-unquote white Western religious expression. So there's a real conflict there, and there's a sense of being torn in multiple directions. And there's a great quote in the translator's preface. The reason I ran upstairs to grab the book, because I want to read this to you. It's on page 18 of my version, which is hopefully your version as well. This one right here. There it is. Anyway, listen to these words from the author. I think this is really interesting. He says, "I received baptism when I was a child. In other words, my Catholicism was a kind of ready-made suit. I had to decide either to make this ready-made suit fit my body or get rid of it and find another suit that fitted. There were many times when I felt I wanted to get rid of my Catholicism, but I was finally unable to do so. It is not just that I did not throw it off, but that I was unable to throw it off. The reason for this must be that it had become a part of me after all. The fact that it had penetrated me so deeply in my youth was a sign, I thought, that it had, in part at least, become coextensive with me. Still, there was always that feeling in my heart that it was something borrowed, and I began to wonder what my real self was like. This, I think, was the mud swamp Japanese in me. From the time I first began to write novels, even to the present day, this confrontation of my Catholic self with the self that lies underneath has, like an idiot's constant refrain, echoed and re-echoed in my work. I felt that I had to make some way to reconcile the two." So he's Catholic. But you can get a sense from that quote how complicated his relationship to Catholicism is. I was reading that quote. I was a comic book nerd growing up, still am in some ways. But if you remember comic books, and Spider-Man comic books in particular, do you remember the character of Venom? And some of you are going, I was not a nerd, I don't know what this is, so sorry, bear with me. But if you know who Venom is, Venom is someone who is jealous of Peter Parker, jealous of Spider-Man, puts on this suit that looks like Spider-Man's suit, but it's more than just a suit. It's actually an alien inhabiting the suit, and it's a black suit with a spider. It's kind of like a weird reverse version of Spider-Man, but it's not just a suit. It's an alien being inhabiting the suit, and when the suit goes on, the alien being becomes coextensive with the person and starts to dominate the person. That's actually wearing the suit. The person wearing the suit becomes less and less while the suit becomes more and more. Kind of a similar vibe when I was reading that, because Endo uses the suit metaphor, not an alien-infused suit, but the suit metaphor to describe how his Catholicism fits him and how it's something that he puts on over his true, quote-unquote, true self. That's how he feels about it. So how do you deal when you are committed to a quote-unquote borrowed religious tradition? For a Japanese individual, even in the 20th century, Catholicism and Christianity in general was borrowed. It was not the quote-unquote national religion. It wasn't naturally what a Christian would, or what a Japanese person would do. It would be the equivalent of a white American, I think, becoming a Hindu. Now, I know the Hare Krishnas are out there and they serve their good lunch every day, but it's still especially in non-college towns, it's a relatively unusual occurrence. Why? Well, because the expectation is that if you were a white American, well, let me just ask you, let me put it this way. If you're a white American, what is the religious expectation? If somebody assumes you have a religious commitment, what is that religious commitment going to be? It's probably not going to be Hinduism, or Buddhism, or Shintoism, or even Islam, for that matter. It's going to be most likely Christianity. Why? Well, because that's the roots of the nation. We are known as a quote-unquote Christian nation. I asked you about that in the reflection this week. But Christianity is seen as Western. It's seen as distinctly American. Now you have a Japanese author who has taken this religious commitment, but struggles with it. And it leads into an interesting question. Is Christianity regional? in the sense of, is it located in certain parts of the world? A lot of people would say yes. A lot of people would say yes. It's basically a Western European / American thing. Although, technically these areas are moving into what we might call post-Christianity, especially Western Europe, is moving into a post-Christian existence. But in terms of religious commitments, if we're leaving atheism and secularism off the table for a second, most people would think that Christianity is the religious lineage of America and Western Europe. Whereas someone in Japan would be, maybe it's Shinto, maybe it's Buddha, maybe it's some other expression. But Christianity, but again, go back to the missionary impulse. The missionary impulse does not suggest that Jesus is just commanding us to make Christians of Americans and Western Europeans. The missionary impulse is universal, which means Jesus in Matthew 28, go back to that section of the scripture we read, go to all the nations. Well, how does that work? How can the story of a Jewish man born in the Middle East 2,000 plus years ago be applicable to all nations and all people? It's a very complicated question. Christianity, I will say that Christianity has shown itself to be extraordinarily adaptable over the centuries, where you do have Christian expressions taking place in places like China and Africa and India, South America. And if you were asked today, honestly, America and Western Europe are some of the least vibrant Christian communities on earth. I mean, you talk about that compared to places like Brazil or places like the aforementioned Africa. I mean, my goodness, you would have to say that a lot of the energy and the vitality of the Christian religion the world over, it's not here. A lot of the institution is here. A lot of the money is here. But when it comes to zeal and vitality and spiritual growth, it's not here. It's in other places. It's in Asia. It's in South America. It ain't here. It's not in Europe either. So Christianity has shown itself to be very adaptable over the years. But there is still a hard process for these people like Endo and also the people like the Japanese Christians in the novel, who there's a national religion that they're expected to follow, but they don't. They follow the quote-unquote outsider's religion, the quote-unquote white religion, Western religion, however you want to do it. Oh, by the way, I mentioned white religion. This is a very live conversation in the African-American community right now, too. And it has been for some time. Where if you have African-Americans who profess Christianity, there will be people go, why are you practicing the white man's religion? Or the white person's religion? And it's a complicated cultural thing that they have to sort out. It's something that, it's not easy. But it's still a live question. So the missionary impulse never goes alone. There's a missionary impulse which is connected to cultural impulses and political impulses. They're all mixed in together, and it's very, very hard to pull them out and separate them. But they make for some really complicated situations. And Endo is a product of one of those. But actually, it's one of the things that makes his writing better, because he's given you his thesis right off the bat. How do we reconcile these things? It's a deep, rich, meaty subject matter, which is produced. Silence is a masterpiece. It's a masterwork of literature. It's been widely recognized as one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. It's worth reading for that very reason. So anyway, the last thing that silence lets us talk about is how to deal with suffering. Theodicy is the technical term. Theodicy. Theodicy. Dealing with evil and dealing with suffering. How, in a religion like Christianity, well, most religions, but like in a religion like Christianity, which definitely has triumphalist notes, the Great Commission, go make disciples, that statement is not made anticipating failure. And Jesus promises his presence in the process. So there are triumphalist notes in Christianity, but what happens when the triumphalism rings hollow because people are suffering, or you're staring in the face of a great evil? How does that work? In the case of silence, wouldn't it be better just to trample on the fumi, and we'll talk about that, and go back to the religion of your people? This has been a live question in Christianity since there has been a Christianity. I think about things like the Book of Job. But in this novel, Silence, you get a clear idea from the title what one of the themes of the novel is going to be. How come we can't hear God? Why is God not speaking? Moreover, why can we not see him? Where is the face of God? There's a quote in the book, the feeling that while men raise their voices in anguish, God remains with folded arms silent. And that's terrifying, because if you believe that God controls everything and God can get you out of whatever situation you're in, but that he refuses to, that he just stands there with his arms folded and not saying a word on your behalf, how do you deal with that? And that's really, really hard. And our main character, Rodriguez, is constantly looking for a reason for the suffering. He wants it to make sense. He wants to have some sort of reason why things are happening like they are. Let me give you an example briefly on page 62. This is after, spoiler alert, this is after some Japanese Christians have been killed. And this is the immediate aftermath. And this is something that he is wrestling with in his own private thoughts. Most of Silence Silence is interesting that in terms of literary genre and style, it'll bounce back and forth between straight up narrative and journal Rodriguez recounting what's happening in a journal format. On page 62 it says this: they were martyred, and what a martyrdom! I had long read about martyrdom in the lives of the saints, how the souls of the martyrs had gone home to heaven, how they had been filled with glory in paradise, how the angels had blown trumpets. This was the splendid martyrdom I had often seen in my dreams. But the martyrdom of the Japanese Christians I now describe to you was no such glorious thing. What a miserable and painful business it was. The rain falls unceasingly on the sea, and the sea which killed them surges on uncannily in silence. I'll skip ahead to page 63. There is no change, but I know what you will say. Their death was not meaningless. It was a stone which in time will be the foundation of the church, and the Lord never gives us a trial which we cannot overcome. Mokishi and Ichizo are with the Lord. Like the numerous Japanese martyrs who have gone before, they now enjoy everlasting happiness. I also, of course, am convinced of all this. And yet, why does this feeling of grief remain in my heart? He gets it. But at the same time, it's not making sense. And it's funny that martyrdom was the topic we touched on here, because we talked about martyrdom before. Think about the ancient accounts of people like Polycarp and Perpetua. Every move is rich with meaning, and every word is convinced. Every single word that's spoken, every single word that's written down, from the very beginning, you know that the Christians win. Even though they die, they win, and they win big. Because they are representing God basically looking at these pagan oppressors and overwhelming them with the power of his saints to stand up and do this. So you have martyrs here. And Rodriguez is expecting something similar. He's expecting that kind of sensation where the earth opens and there's some sort of plausible sign that these martyrs have done something worthwhile, something important, something mighty for the God that they serve. And what do they have instead? The waves keep rolling in on the ocean. The rain keeps falling. God remains with folded arms, silent. And how do you deal with that? And you're going to see in the novel how he attempts to deal with that. How he keeps calling out and calling out and calling out and making connections and solidarity with Jesus. And I'm already excited to talk to you next week when we finish the novel, because it's powerful how it happens. So, one more thing to say before, so I'll leave it there in terms of silence. One more thing to say. How you might be wondering, how in the world do we write quiz questions on this? Because it's a novel. It's not a nonfiction informational text. It's a novel. How do we write questions? Focus on the main themes. That helps. Also, don't be tricky. I don't want obscure plot points. Like, I don't care what town the priest found Kichijiro in. Don't say that as your true false. Say things that come back to these themes that we've already mentioned earlier. Like, for example, the example I give you here, Sebastian Rodriguez's faith never wavers in his sufferings. That is directly related to the plot, to some of the main points that we've been talking about, the main plot of the novel. So if you stick with that, you'll be in good shape. But if you have any questions, again, let me know. Otherwise, we will come back together next week and finish this conversation. But I hope you enjoy the novel. Again, it's a classic. It's a masterwork. You really got to read it. So I'm excited to give you the opportunity to read it. I hope you enjoy it.